Welcome back to Democracy Docket's 2024 Candidate Q&A series. My name is Crystal Hill, and today I'm joined by Ohio Supreme Court Justice Melanie Stewart. We're going to talk about the role of the state Supreme Court in election and voting cases, and also gerrymandering, which is a big deal in Ohio. Thank you so much, Justice Stewart, for taking the time and for joining Democracy Docket today. I just wanted to start by asking why you decided to run for re-election, and also for people who don't know, can you talk about what it takes to run a successful state Supreme Court campaign?
A lot of luck, a lot of support. Well, first, let me go back to your first question. Thank you for having me. Thanks for doing this interview. I think what does it take to run a successful campaign? Why am I running? I'm running to be reelected to the seat that over 1.8 million voters elected me to in 2018. I was honored, privileged to have that vote of confidence in my being able to do the job then as a judicial candidate with 12 years experience at the Court of Appeals level. Now I'm 5.5 years later, I'm an even stronger jurist on the court, and with almost 18 years of appellate court experience, I am the most experienced appellate jurist currently serving on the Ohio Supreme Court. But unfortunately, sometimes none of that matters, because if you can't get that message out, then people default to other things. And in this case, I think what my opponent is hoping that people will default to is the fact of party affiliation. This will be my first time. This is my 12th judicial race. This will be my first time ever running with a party affiliation under my name. The General Assembly in Ohio, the supermajority in the General Assembly, with lack of bipartisan support, decided to put party affiliation on the ballot this year in hopes of helping their candidates be more successful in getting candidates of the other political party off the court. So I have an opponent this year who got appointed to the court by one person, his friend, the governor, and had no prior judicial experience coming to the Supreme Court with that appointment. He's the only jurist on the Ohio Supreme Court with no prior judicial experience, and I mean none. Not as a judge, not as a trial court judge, an appellate court judge, not as a magistrate, never even aspired for judicial office. He's never run for judicial seat. And so that who is going to run against me this year, and the only reason I think he's empowered to do so is because now there's party affiliation on the ballot, and it is his hope that people don't look at the backgrounds or the qualifications or the characteristics of us and just default to that party label. So how do I run a successful campaign? It's going to look a lot different than the campaign we ran in 2018, because that campaign was based on credentials. And I have to say, my opponent in 2018 was a far superior candidate than my opponent this year. But factors other than quality will come into play. And so whether I'm successful or not remains to be seen. I guess we'll know in about 75 days.
And I'm curious, do you agree with the decision to have party affiliation on the ballot for state Supreme Court, especially when I think the general thinking is that, it's nonpartisan, or that, there's an expectation of impartiality?
No, I don't agree with it. It is the stoking, the politicization of the court, I believe, does not serve any legitimate purpose. But more importantly, not only do I not agree, I don't agree as a citizen, I don't agree as a voter, I don't agree as a jurist. But more importantly, again, this is a move that got no bipartisan support. It was a move that took place after a 7-0 one-party majority of the Supreme Court suddenly became, well, I wouldn't say suddenly, over a few years, became a 4-3 majority. So then now people want to know what party affiliation their judges and judicial candidates are. I don't think so. Another problem is it's not on all judicial races. It's just Court of Appeals and Supreme Court. There are 7 Supreme Court justices who sit on the court. 2 are up every other year. The chief seat is up every 6 years. There are 69 appellate court judges in the state, and about a third are up every other year. There are hundreds of trial court judges on the ballot, and they don't have party affiliation. Those are the judges that people see every day. They put people in jail. They terminate your parental rights. They decide your medical malpractice lawsuit. So they see people. We don't really see people. The lawyers come in and argue cases. So it's important. Not only, no, I don't agree with it, but neither did, again, a bipartisan part of our legislature. The Ohio State Bar Association, the state's largest bar association, representative of our bar, they disagreed with it. The Ohio Judicial Conference, made up of Republican and Democratic judges, disagreed with it. And so it is nothing but pure, raw political power. And I think anybody who is interested in good government would disagree with the decision to do that.
That's so significant, and it actually leads to another question I was going to ask later, but since we're on the topic,
Okay.
you sort of alluded to this, but I'm curious, do you think that not just in Ohio, but overall, that like state Supreme Courts have become more political, especially as people, I think, after 2020 realized just how powerful these courts can be in terms of, being the final stop for a lot of cases. Do you worry that, I guess, the purpose of the court can kind of get lost in these partisan battles that are now being held over, control of the court? And even in Ohio, a Republican majority is possibly at stake. So I'm curious if you think that things are getting a little bit too partisan for what the court should be.
I think things are getting very partisan, politically partisan, and it has no place in the judiciary. And I think it will serve to further erode confidence in the judiciary. And when that happens, I think we're on a downward spiral that will take yeoman's effort to recover.
Based on what I see, it seems like there's a general misunderstanding about what it means for a judge to possibly have a liberal judicial philosophy or have maybe more conservative judicial philosophy, and how that impacts how that judge interprets the law. Can you talk more about what it means that you are running as a Democrat? If I'm a voter, does that mean that you are going to vote a certain way on issues? Like, can you sort of break down what that means for viewers?
Yes, it shouldn't mean anything, because
Mhm.
the fact that I'm running as a Democrat cannot tell you how I'm going to vote on an issue, because every judge in the state of Ohio, Democrat or Republican, takes the exact same oath. It's the oath to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the United States and the Constitution and the laws in the state of Ohio. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean that we can't differ on interpretations, but our oath is to uphold the law. So if the law says what it says, then it should be pretty plain. I know people are probably questioning that with a recent decision that has come out of our court dealing with boneless chicken wings. Does the word boneless really mean without bones? There are three of us that thought, yeah, that means what it says, without bones, and four in the majority who said, no, that's not what it means. It's a cooking style. To not even allow someone to proceed to whether there should be liability for horrendous injuries he suffered in swallowing a bone that was in allegedly that he paid for a boneless chicken meal. So, those sort of things I think shake the confidence of the public in the judiciary. If that decision, if it was made and motivated by any other reason other than the interpretation of the law, which obviously three of us disagreed with, then that's problematic, because litigants should be able to predict the outcome of cases based on plain meaning of the word, based on prior judicial decisions, and we can't lose sight of common sense. This was a case that got kicked out, that never even got before a jury, that got kicked out as a matter of law, because the law that comes out of this case is as a matter of law, no reasonable person could think that the word boneless meant without bones. So
Wow, I did not know about that case, but that is very interesting, and it kind of illustrates how cases like this can turn on such seemingly small details.
Sure. And liberal versus conservative, is that shouldn't have any place because there are certain rules and guidelines and standards that guide our review of cases. If it's a criminal law and it's ambiguous, then it inures to the benefit of the defendant. That's legal analysis. That's what we're supposed to do. And if you're conservative, if a conservative approach is, well, no, try to uphold a conviction at all costs, well, then that's in violative of your oath of office. Because again, if the law is ambiguous, it goes in favor of one party over the other. If it's civil litigation, if whoever drafts a contract, and there's some error or some ambiguity or something missing, then it's the fault of the party who drafted the contract. And even if you want the other side to win. So those kind of slants or outcome result oriented cases should not have a place in judicial decision making.
Interesting. And, we talked about running a campaign as a justice. Uh, I noticed on your campaign website, you touted your commitment to democracy and talked about how you decided an important gerrymandering case, why gerrymandering is important to you, why you decided to highlight that specific opinion. Is it something that is just on your mind or that you think is going to come before the court? There is a lawsuit currently against LaRose over the gerrymandering ballot initiative. And so I'm just curious how you, I guess, would approach the issue as a jurist and why it's important to you.
Well, and as a citizen, am I opposed to gerrymandering? Absolutely, by any political party. I don't think politicians should be able to choose their voters. I think voters should be able to choose their elected officials. So, as a personal matter, of course, I'm opposed to gerrymandering. Are all maps that people can legitimately disagree on necessarily gerrymandered? No, I don't believe that. And so my approach is not to find that a map is gerrymandered. It is to look at the law that applies to how those maps are drawn and to see whether, with the application of that law, and in the case that you're talking about there, whether it was deemed unconstitutional based on the hearings that we had, based on the things that were said, based on maps that were drawn, that were more representative, just based on the evidence that was presented. Were those maps in violation of the Constitution? As four of us read it, they were multiple times. Three members of my colleague of the court, three of my colleagues thought not. And so, some people looked at it as the overall purpose of the redistricting maps being voted on as amended was to not have gerrymandered districts drawn. So if that's the will of the people, and I believe that those ballot initiatives passed by over 70%, if the people are saying we don't want gerrymandered districts drawn, then that's what they're saying. And for any jurist to say, well, you wrote it wrong, that might have been your intention, but you didn't write the amendment strong enough to affect that outcome, I just think is ludicrous. And again, but again, in those cases, the evidence was on the side of those maps being unconstitutional time and time again. And so I think the refusal to follow those maps by the redistricting commission and the dissents in those cases not only, in my opinion, obviously written, the one I wrote and the ones I agreed with, not only defied the applicable constitutional analysis, but it totally thwarted the will of the overwhelming majority of the will of the people who voted to say, draw fair maps.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned how the campaign you ran in 2018 is not the campaign you're running now, because of the difference in party affiliation. I'm curious how you illustrate the stakes of this race to voters how are you engaging with them? Because when I look at the news, I see, Republican majorities at stake, Democrats want to take the court. Is is that how you sort of characterize the race, or I guess I'm curious what those conversations look like.
No, I don't categorize the race that way. The parties do, obviously. Um, and, you know, the Democratic Party and Republican Party. The problem with our judiciary is, you know, because there are two majority parties, you're always going to get judges who are going to belong to one of those parties, and you're going to have those parties making their best case for their candidate to be elected in a partisan fashion. And unfortunately, the way the system is done, we can probably never have an independent person become a judge in the state. They have to get more signatures for their petitions than people in the major parties do. You're not going to have anybody with the resources that are going to help to support their candidacy like you would the Democratic or Republican Party. And I think that's unfortunate. I think a large majority of judicial candidates in running for election and judges running for reelection would do so as an unaffiliated or independent voter if they could, but it's prohibited to do so. And so the taking over the court or whether the balance of the court shifts, that those are all political things. My agenda, I run based on the fact that on no planet, quite frankly, is my opponent better suited to be on the court, let alone stay on the court and have me removed from the court. Um, I've been a jurist, an appellate jurist for almost 18 years. I'm the most experienced appellate jurist currently sitting on the court of all seven of us. I am the most educated jurist on the court, not having a bachelor's degree and a law degree, as we all do, but also having a PhD in a social science PhD, which helps me to ask the right questions and think more about potential unintended consequences of our decision making. I don't just serve in my capacity as a Supreme Court justice sitting on the bench in a robe. It is my responsibility as a statewide elected official to get across the state to administer the oath of office to newly elected officials or reelected officials, both Republican and Democrat, to have my chambers open as much as possible for law students to extern with me. And I work directly with my externs. I don't, push them off to law clerks. I grade their papers. I go over their papers. I teach them as much as I can teach them, because I want them to be good lawyers and maybe down the road good jurists too. I go and I judge moot court arguments at our law schools. I try to be available everywhere I can to help people who are thinking about law school or thinking about being a lawyer or to get where I am, since I'm the first person elected to the Supreme Court in the state's history who looks like me. So those are responsibilities that I take seriously, and my being on the court will not be as fulfilling if I'm the last person who looks like me on the court in our lifetime.
That's actually a perfect segue, because I did want to ask you, obviously your 2018 election was historic for Ohio. And really, I mean, nationally, it's significant, to see a state high court elect a Black woman to the bench for the first time. I'm curious how your identity, informs, your approach to litigating, or, does it factor in at all, or is it something that you don't think about? I'm just curious what role it plays.
It plays a role in that I think a court that sits en banc, a full court, like the Supreme Court's, which has all of their judges weighing in on decisions, and to a large degree two appellate courts that sit in panels of three, should be as diverse as possible. And by diversity, I don't just mean ethnic or gender diversity, background diversity. I mean, I came up in a poor neighborhood in Cleveland and was raised by a single mother whose formal education only went up to the 8th grade because she was raised in the segregated South. We all have biases, our implicit biases and unconscious biases, and we all do, and we all need to recognize that. And when we're forming opinions, and making decisions about people and what should happen with their lives and why they do the things they do, we need to recognize that we aren't all knowing. We don't understand everything. So I think a diversity of background and diversity of perspectives is good because it helps inform our decision making. And so um, I I might think about something differently from my colleagues because I've lived the experience or I've seen it firsthand, as opposed to just some theoretical view of life or a particular aspect of life. And so I think that is important. And I think it lends credence to a judiciary that is more representative of the population that it serves. And in our case, it's the entire state of Ohio. It's not just urban Ohio or rural Ohio or suburban Ohio. It is all of those parts of Ohio. It is blue collar workers. It is white collar. It is no collar. It is criminal defendants, and it is corporations, and it's public entities. And if the law's on your side, you should win. And I think having as diverse a background and as much representation intellectually, educationally, et cetera, on the court is good for the court and good for the people we serve.
You talked about background and how it how it can lend itself to this role, but you really have emphasized like experience. And I'm curious, do you think that there is a certain level of experience that is required to sit on a high court? Because even at the national level, there's varying levels of experience as far as like how long they've been judges on lower courts. So I'm curious, like, what do you think the baseline is for being an effective jurist on a high court?
Well, I don't know if there's a baseline because obviously, even those of us who are already jurists had to start from a place of not being a jurist, right? And so I will even admit that not having prior judicial experience is the end all be all to being on the highest court. For instance, there are many lawyers who practice routinely in our court who I think would be outstanding jurists, quite frankly. Just listening to them arguing, reading their work product, they know appellate law, they know appellate jurisdiction, and would bring, quite frankly, a background that maybe all of us who are currently sitting on the court hasn't had. Those regular practitioners who come into our court, but having some quality background and experience that adds to making the court better. And so if you bring none of that, if you bring no prior judicial experience, if you don't bring years of practice in our court, if you don't bring an appellate background, if you don't bring something that tangible that people can evaluate, then you're saying, just elect me because I want to be there. Or you're saying, elect me because I'm a member of X political party. And that's what I think we have this year. We've got, I take my credentials, my background, my qualifications, my experience. I just say to people, just look at it and look at it compared to my opponents. If you do that and you think he's the better person for the court, then by all means you should vote for him. I just don't think on any planet would you find that. And so I think if you're looking for quality, if you're looking for good public service, look, my opponent has spent decades as a politician, which I think is anathema to, a judicial career, for one. The connections of how my opponent got to the court based on, my crisscrossing the state and talking about what I want to do in the court and how I would serve my time on the court, and having over 1.8 million people vote me to that position as opposed to being appointed by my friend is I think information that people should have. Again, I'm not saying anything that's not factual. It's simply it's the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And so I think if we do that, then heads and shoulders, I win by a large margin. But I know that the judiciary is the least understood branch of government. I know there's no way I can touch and concern 2.5 to 3 million voters, which I think is what will be needed in this upcoming race. And so some people who do choose to exercise their right to vote and who want to vote in every race might default to things that are comfortable for them or that are familiar to them. There are going to be people who might vote for me because I've got the female name, or there are people who vote based on, I think, the ethnicity of names. And so when you don't have information or facts, you default to what's familiar or what's, recognizable. And so I'm trying to combat that and asking people to really look at credentials and qualities first and foremost.
And what do you think the biggest misconception about the court is? Because you kind of talked about how, the judiciary is so misunderstood, or that, people don't really have the strongest grasp compared to other branches of government. So I guess, especially as you're talking to voters, what do you think a misconception is that people have about the court?
I think the biggest is that we base decisions based on what we think and what we feel and what we think the outcome should be, and that's not it. And I will say that for again, every jurist elected in our state takes an oath to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States and of the state of Ohio. And again, we could differ on interpretation, but the overwhelming majority of us, I will say, are not results oriented. And it's not just what we think. It's not our personal decisions that matter. There's sometimes I have to make a decision on a case as a judge that I think is wrong, that I think personally is wrong, morally is wrong, that I think it works an injustice against some people. But if the law says that, then that's what I have to apply. Now, the beauty, of course, as an appellate jurist, as a Supreme Court justice, is I get to say, I have to apply the law as written, but it works an injustice, and the General Assembly should revisit that. So I get to talk about the injustice or the inequities or the wrongful application or the unintended consequences or what bad effect the law has. I always made a commitment, even as appellate court judge, to write about that. Anytime I see injustice, I'm going to write about it, even if my judicial decision had to be to uphold that injustice.
Yeah, that must be so difficult at times to have to put your personal feelings aside, especially if it is like, a sensitive case, having to put those personal feelings aside and basically put the law first, which, it seems like jurists, that is their most important objective, is to uphold and interpret the law.
Well, and Crystal, ironically, it seems like it would be, but it's not. Because it is separate from empathy or sympathy or connection. I mean, it breaks my heart what's going on in the Middle East. It breaks my heart that children and families are suffering and people are being kidnapped and cities are being bombed. I feel that, and if I could do anything to stop it, I would. And so I remember as an appellate court judge, I wrote a dissent in a case once where someone was convicted for a crime. Some post DNA testing, revealed that this person wasn't responsible for the crime, yet the judge kept him in prison anyway. And later, the Innocence Project did stay involved, and the man was exonerated. I remember writing a dissent when the case first came to us, and you let it go after that because you do what you can. And it just so happens where this crime took place, I'd have to pass that building every Sunday on my way to church. And I remember stopping at a light sometimes and looking at the building, praying for not only the victim who was killed in this case, the two small children that she left behind, and the man who I, without a question, believe was not guilty of the crime, not based on anything I knew about him or I didn't even know what he looked like, but just based on the evidence. He should have never been convicted of the crime, and who professed his innocence, who, when convicted, said, I know you, to the judge and the prosecutor, I know you're just doing your job, but you've got the wrong person. And just saying is just, and wrote the dissent, and then you have to move on to the next case. But I remember all those years saying, if he is truly an innocent, hopefully he won't die in prison. Hopefully the system will work and something will happen that he finally gets his freedom. And about, 6-8 years later, he did. He was exonerated. And so that's a full circle moment for me. That's a, if I never write another judicial opinion in my life, I'm glad I was able to be there to write the dissent in that case, which later, led to litigation that got him eventually exonerated.
Yeah, that's so powerful because I think, you want to think that people who are making these huge life-changing decisions are, that there is a certain degree of personal feelings, not that it's influencing the decision, but that, you do care. You do, it does affect you. It's not simply, I wrote this and I'm moving on. I mean, I guess to a
Sure,
degree it is, but it sounds like you're saying, I still think about it. It's still in my mind, even if I
sure.
can't
And people
professionally.
want to know that they're being seen and they want to be heard and that their positions are taken. And it's sometimes, I mean, we can't cure all ills. None of us can in any aspect of life. And you accept that, but you do your job, you do it to the best of your ability, and you recognize that there are people on the end of these decisions. Every day, there are people on the end of these decisions, and they're victims of crime, and regardless of outcomes, you still recognize the humanity in everything that we do, even for people who do commit heinous crimes. And,
Mhm.
the vast majority of people who are convicted of crimes are not going to be sentenced to death or spend their life in prison. They're going to come back out. And so, what do we want? To reintegrate them into our society so that they become respectable members of our society and taxpayers and good neighbors? Or would we rather just burden them with collateral consequences of what sometimes is just poor decisions and bad decisions, not bad people? And would we rather them just have to get back out in society and re-victimize us? No, I'd rather reintegrate them in society and make them a part of what's good in our society as opposed to relegate them to second and third class citizens.
Right, right. I've already kept you for far too long, but I did want to end with a question about your background
Okay.
because I loved the whole like your name is Melody and you went into music. But I'm curious, obviously now that you're a jurist, do you still, use your music degree in any way? Does it help at all with with being on the court? Is that still just something that's a part of your life?
It will always be a part of my life. It's I loved it too. I studied music in college because it's the only thing I was interested in. Unfortunately, my mother let me find my own way. Although when I did bring my first report card home, and although the grade point average was good, she kind of frowned, and I asked what was wrong. And she said, orchestration, score reading, analysis of music, theory, piano. Honey, do you take any reading and writing courses? And I said, I take French and English. And so I studied it because that's all I was interested in. And later, when I was an assistant dean of admissions at law school, and prospective law students would call and say, should I be a political science major? Should I want to change my major from government to business, but should I? Because I'm thinking of a law school. Well, recognize that everybody doesn't think of law school when they're in college. And so I say, study what you love in undergraduate school. Your grades will be better, and you'll be more passionate about it. So um, was it fortuitous that my mother named me Melody and I studied music? It ended up that I loved it enough never to try to make a living doing it. And so law is where I make my living, and so music can be my hobby. But it is still a very integral part of my life, from recorded music to composing my own music to learning new instruments to playing new instruments to discovering new music. I mean, it's the calm in my life. So after reading for hours or authoring a difficult decision, it might be 2 or 3 in the morning, and I'll blast Chopin Nocturne, or I'd sit at the piano and try to remember something I used to play 20 years ago or so. So it's still a very vital part of my life.
That's so great that like now it's something that you use to kind of unwind or kind of um, you know, decompress and just sort of,
My,
after,
yeah,
you know,
curated playlists as I crisscross the state campaigning. Gets me home faster or gets me to some location faster. Yeah, that and audiobooks.
thank you so much for tuning in to today's candidate Q&A series with Democracy Docket. To stay up to date on all voting rights news, please subscribe to our free newsletter. Thank you so much.